Welcome to Spotlight on Seniors. My name is Steve Raymond. We're coming to you today from the shores of the beautiful Damariscotta River in Newcastle, Maine. Today, we're going to be looking at the Maine economy through the lens of our aging population. My guest today is Marcus Hutchins, who is the columnist that writes the weekly Coastal Economist in the Lincoln County News. Marcus is well-degreed from Columbia University in economics. He's a former Treasury bond arbitrage trader, which I had to go to Wikipedia to even understand what that meant. And he's a former hedge fund manager as well. He was successful enough in that career to be able to retire in his early 40s to Southport, and now he's locally prominent here and contributes greatly to our local community. Marcus, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Steve. Thank you.
All right, glad to have you. So Marcus, you work in the world of statistics and reports and economic analysis, and for me as a relatively informed layperson, I'm always a little bit confused about whether I'm looking at someone's ideological spin and their political affiliations, and I wanted to understand, when you and your colleagues are together, is the data that you look at, you may have different decisions about what you want to do with it, but is the raw data itself reliable and can be agreed upon?
If the data that we're looking at is coming from government agencies, for example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Reserve System, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, these are highly reliable statistics. They're as good as it gets when all is said and done. And if you're looking internationally, you can go to the OECD database. Now, each of the countries individually contribute to those databases, but again, that's about as good as it gets. And I haven't seen economists make claims that the data is foul of those sources. You'll see newscasts that sometimes will bring to question numbers, but the numbers are the numbers. They're as good as it gets. But one has to be careful to understand what those numbers mean.
Right. So how about the state competitiveness report, which I looked at after you informed me about it, and I tried to get a sense of Maine and where we are. Do you trust the state competitiveness report?
Yes and no. Some of the data that they used for that report included advertising by the states.
Oh.
And so they assumed in making that report that some of the, whatever a state advertised, that was what they felt they were good at.
Right.
And so they utilized that. In other words, when there was missing data, and economists always want more data.
Right.
I mean, that's how we figure out if our models are accurate, is we look at data. We first create a theory, we make a model that mirrors that theory, and then we apply data to it to see if it works in the real world. And in the absence of data, they inferred things from how states advertise. And so I think that there's a lot to be said, though, for that particular piece. I think there's some reason to think that if it isn't perfectly cardinally accurate, it's certainly ordinally accurate,
right?
If that makes sense.
It does. It does. Where there's the meta picture, the larger picture in economics, and then there's always how does that picture play out on the ground with real businesses and workers and people who are concerned about their own future. So today I'm kind of hoping we get some glimpses of the larger picture and then ground it right into what's really going on in Maine here. So one of the things that always strikes me is, I said it to you in a previous meeting, it's like, you know, someone hiccups in Greece and there's something happening over there and all of a sudden everybody's worried about their portfolios here and it has a real effect upon us. And the world is now a globalized world. And there's Puerto Rico and in Portugal previously, there's all these unpredictable things that occur that influence individuals and influence states. So how do you register with all that in terms of the Maine state economy being subject to the variability of a global market?
To be honest, when I think about the global markets versus my own little portfolio, for example, I never thought I would see the day when Greece made my profit and loss statement go up and down significantly. That was, and I start to ask myself the question, why? Why is Greece 30 years ago was insignificant for anybody's portfolio in Maine?
Right.
Why would it be the case now? I think part of the issue is when you have large blocks of wealth concentrated in a few hands, they move together. And so we have been moving down a path of wealth concentration and income concentration, and that tends to create a volatility. And so a news event over here, which is seemingly unrelated, will cause an avalanche across the world because there are fewer and fewer decision makers that just follow a herd. And,
right. Is that partially related to, for example, automatic computerized trading and large institutional investors swinging the market?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The first time I think historically we saw that in a big way was September of 1987. Some of the viewers would remember the day in September of 87 when their portfolio just shrunk dramatically. Single day, it was breathtaking. I was at the Chicago Board of Trade on that day, and I was heavily involved in the markets. And that was purely and simply a matter of computer trading. What had happened leading up to that, we'd had a very large stock market rally, and there was a thing called portfolio insurance. Wall Street houses were selling to fund managers, quote, portfolio insurance, which was really a giant put. But from the point of view of a market trader, they were just sell-stop orders resting just below the market, and they tracked the market going up. So as soon as we reached a point, what I call maximum euphoria, where everybody that wants in is in, the market started to sag. Well, as soon as it sagged, it touched off the first sell-stop orders of this portfolio insurance, computer-driven. Well, that selling took to the next level down, which touched the next sell-stop orders. And that selling hit the next sell-stop orders, et cetera, et cetera. And before you know it, in one day,
trillions lost.
Lost, right?
Trillions lost.
And that was really the first time that we saw that kind of phenomenon. It was not hard to predict that, really. The whole portfolio insurance was a Wall Street product, and it's fine if a few people buy it, but when a lot of people buy it, then it's useless.
Right. Now, we could stay in the big picture and talk about Brexit and all that, but I think I'm going to come closer to Maine now.
Sure.
So, right now we have 26 Mainers every single day turning 65, coming into retirement age.
It's a big number.
So, yes,
it's a big number for a small state.
For a small state. We're only 1.3 million people here, so whatever, about 8,000-ish or so coming to retirement age. We have a diminishing workforce. I believe that our workforce just, at least in our healthcare workforce, we already see it. We're very contracted in terms of the people that we're able to hire to get the actual work done. And so the proportion, and I believe that the ratio between people dying and people being born in Maine right now is actually there's people are dying more rapidly than they are being born. That's what I just read on the Maine Economic Policy
I wasn't aware
Center.
of that, but I can see it.
So how do you see that in terms of Maine's economic future? Because they're saying we're looking at losing another 20,000 job positions in the next 4 or 5 years by 2020.
Look to Japan. They're the leading indicator, right?
Yes, right.
They're
of aging.
Aging and shrinking population.
Shrinking population, right.
Both. So we can look to them to see what's going on there. Because that's relevant for our situation. certainly the economy of Maine will be transformed with that. You'll have spenders who are not seeking jobs. How much they are in terms of spending, that's a question, but spending creates jobs. But those jobs are different than the kind of jobs when you have young people here. One of the things that I think about when I consider the direction of Maine demographically is I think we have to be very careful what we vote for as far as a federal set of policies. Maine will not survive on its own. And as an analogy, we have in the Eurozone cross-border movement of labor. It's very easy for somebody in Portugal to move to Germany. If you're a young person, you come out of college and you look at Portugal, you have very few jobs. So you move to Germany. But what happens in Germany, or what happens then to the population left in Portugal is they don't have that job base and they don't have that tax base to pay for their elderly.
Right.
And in the Eurozone, there's no federal footprint to redistribute those funds out, those Medicare funds. They're all done domestically, so it's a disaster for these people.
Right.
We could have the same problem in Maine if we decide we want to shrink the federal footprint to a point where it's really gone into oblivion. We need to, from Maine's point of view, we need to keep a federal footprint that's sufficiently large to flow those Medicare funds and those Social Security funds back to the state.
Right, right. So there was the possibility of Medicaid expansion, and our state was one of the states that turned that down. Did that make economic sense? Was that an ideological reason for doing that? How do you view that?
Well, I would say that was an ideological mistake, actually. The logic behind that decision, I think, was that we receive 100% of those funds, but the time comes when we'll have to potentially provide 10% of those funds. So let's not do anything. Let's just ignore the 100% to give up the 10%. The reason I suggest that was ideological and not really sound economics, we can analyze it from many different points of view, but one point of view is, I saw a study, this was very recent, last 6 months or so, very broad study looking at children born in poverty in the U.S. And they tracked them from birth to retirement. And they looked at two groups. One group had a government-funded Medicaid. The other did not. And what ended up happening was that health care for the young at their early age changed their economic path. And they advanced in education, they advanced in their professional lives to a point where the tax receipts received by the public sector from them exceeded what was paid in Medicaid to give them health care when they were young. That is the differential in what they paid versus the other group. So that Medicaid actually funded itself through the process.
And helps to elevate the workforce.
Well, it helps in so many different regards, but the point I'm making is you don't have to look at that and say, gee, that's the right thing to do.
Right, right.
You could use greed as the motivation and say, well, that works, and I'll make money back on it.
Right,
so you don't have to look at it ideologically as this is the right thing to do, but rather you could actually just...
Well, I think, so there gets to be a discussion on philosophically and by one person's morals, they would say this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But so frequently, what I have felt in some of the ideological debates is, yeah, but this makes business sense. Whether or not you think it's morally right or immoral, it makes business sense.
Right.
It makes business sense to that we have a healthy working class in this state. We need that. We can't
Yeah, economists use that term business sense. We use the word efficient.
Efficient.
It's economically efficient.
Okay. Right. So I read this expression, what was it? It was, as the workforce goes, so does the economy. It makes sense to me. If the workforce isn't doing well, the economy is going to contract, not do well. If the workforce is but this is, so there's the current topical discussion about the concentration of wealth, which you mentioned before. I think part of the view is there's the ideological, but does the concentration of wealth, because we remember the trickle-down theory and supply-side economics that were talked about a couple decades ago, does it really make economic sense to have wealth concentrated? Or is there another, and with the idea that wealth, then those people are producers, they create jobs, and does that prove true in the life of our state and other states?
Well, traditionally in economics, let me back up for a moment to say that one of the principles of economics is people respond to incentives.
Yes.
And we do. We all respond to incentives. That's linked to a trade-off. In economics, we have trade-offs. We can have an aircraft carrier, or we can have so many libraries. You know, we have to balance those. Everything's a balance. One of the big trade-offs in our economy is between economic efficiency on the one hand and equality on the other hand. Mm-hmm. But you can have too much of a good thing or too much of a bad thing. I think of a bowl of chowder that has no salt in it. It's not going to taste especially great. You add a little salt, it'll taste better. You add a little more salt, tastes better. But you reach a point where the salt is just too much.
Yes.
And you're ruining the chowder. So we are no longer in the trade-off zone between efficiency and equality. We've marched for about 35 years in a direction of redistributing income and wealth from the bottom to the top.
To the top.
And recent studies, so even conservative think tanks like the IMF have been noting in a number of economic papers that have come out recently that we're on the backside of that curve, meaning we now have so much inequality that it's harming efficiency.
That it's harming efficiency.
It's harming efficiency.
Right.
Economies that have the kind of inequality that we have find that their boom cycles are shorter and their bust cycles are deeper. So it makes for a volatile economy. So we're not balanced very well right now. We need to find ways to move back towards a more balanced center.
Was the redistribution of wealth upwards a factor of tax policy? Was it a factor of wages staying stagnant? How did that primarily occur, or possibly both?
This is a question economists have asked themselves for quite a while. Is it immigration? Is it trade with China? Is it minimum wage deteriorating? Is it tax policies? Is it limited access to education? It's probably not so much that one, but it is the other four, and they've all made their contribution. So
something I can sympathize with on the conservative side of the argument. There was a time, so the Laffer curve, at one time 91% taxation. That seems pretty outrageous, and was probably, I don't know how it was for the economy, but just as a concept, 91% taxation on companies seems pretty outrageous. Now we're towards 50%. What's is 70 the happy medium? Where do you think we should be in terms of trying to re-equalize the distribution of wealth?
When the tax rate in the 60s was in that 90% range, that was the top income tax bracket.
Yes, right. Top.
And I think that back then what the message really was is if you're earning more than the cutoff that hits the 91%, if you're earning more than that, you're really not contributing more than that to society. You've just figured out a way to attract money to yourself, what economists call rent,
right,
or monopoly power or monopsony power. Just they all mean kind of the same thing in this context. And so that was the philosophy. Well, back then, if a CEO of a company had the ability to double his or her income, there was no incentive to do that because 91% of it would disappear. And that's just on the federal side. We got away from that. We eventually, by, I think it was it 1986, I believe? By 1986, we got the top tax rate on the federal level down to 28%. Well, suddenly there's an incentive for a CEO who has the capability to change his income stream to move it up.
Right.
And at the same time, we allowed the minimum wage to slide. We broke labor unions, so the
starting with
bargaining power of those,
right,
air traffic controllers.
Air traffic controllers.
So all of that's a contributor. And then here in Maine, we suffered greatly with the trade in China that got our mills closed. So that change in manufacturing really has hurt.
Another aspect of the globalization. I've had some business experiences that are, I kind of see both sides of it. I've been responsible for a payroll out of my own personal pocket and have a company that had about 100 full-time employee equivalents. And, I recognized even, relatively small shifts in paying wages and benefits and creates huge changes in the bottom line. And
sure, 100 employees will do that.
Yeah, it does in terms of how you're trying to compete in the market. But it seems our wages in Maine now have been suppressed for a long time. And how do you feel about the current minimum wage proposals and what businesses should be doing with that? And in terms of the benefit for our workers and then also for the state, as an economist, how do you see that?
Well, we can look to past performance in the U.S. We can look to performance in other places of the world. That's really what we have. There was a time when economists looked at the labor market as though it were a commodity market, but the commodity was labor. And it followed the rules of supply and demand. Today, there's a growing body of literature that indicates that it's really not characterized by a competitive market model, but the labor market is more of what we call a monopsonist market, where the buyer of labor, which is businesses, has more control over wages than do the sellers of labor, which are the workers.
Right.
And in that environment, it's actually economically efficient to put a floor on wages. If the labor market is characterized as a competitive market, putting an artificial floor, raising the market clearing wage has the potential of creating unemployment. But if it's a monopsonist market, that's a whole different story. And I personally believe that the market is more monopsonist, and we can look back to the 1960s, 1950s, and 60s in this country, where the minimum wage was a much larger piece of the pie than it is today, maybe nearly triple the piece of pie that it is today. And the economy was fine then. Life went on.
Yes.
Now, we can't just triple the minimum wage today in an instant. That would be very disruptive to a lot of small businesses.
Yes. But
if we had a path that moved it up, that would allow small businesses to adjust, and it could get us back to what we were like earlier.
Right. Just an incremental path just would seem to make sense. So as a senior care professional, I have huge concerns about the social fabric of our state, because of our aging population, because of workforce availability, also because of Maine Care. I very much recognize there'll never be enough Maine care to satisfy all the needs, and there's an increasing burden being placed upon it. And so I'm not even sure the question I'm asking you. It's a deep concern for me about projecting, say, 10 years into the future. The burden that's going to be upon our younger workers and how we're going to manage that and yet keep a semblance of a safety net for our seniors that need that safety net.
Those are scary things, no doubt about it. My son-in-law, anecdotally, he's a health care professional, mental health care specialist in Massachusetts, and he said there are a number of job openings across Maine. You could almost pick your spot and pick your salary because there's a huge shortage. If we don't get enough, a sufficient amount of these services set up on the federal level, we are going to have problems. To the extent that we relegate all of these things to the individual states, that's a problem. The only choice we have then in Maine is to alter our population through immigration. I mean, that's really where you come.
Which actually is a recommendation of the Maine Center for Economic Policy right now. They're saying we should be encouraging immigration of foreign workers, high-skilled foreign workers, to be able to come here to take up we can't solve it within the state ourselves. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
All right, well, Marcus, as I suspected, I would rather have 90 minutes to talk to you, because I know we've barely scratched the surface.
Economists are too dull for 90 minutes.
Yeah.
Nobody can handle that.
Yeah, but tell me, are you an optimist or a pessimist when you look at our situation right now? How do you, just in your...
I think that people in Maine are savvy people. People in Maine are smart enough to figure out how they need to vote, what they need to do. And Mainers are survivors. We know how to survive in this state.
Right.
And so I'm always optimistic about the future. There are challenges ahead of us because of our demographics and the things you've mentioned, but to be pessimistic about that, I think, is wrong.
And counterproductive.
It's also counterproductive. Yeah. But I think that, excuse me, I think in the end, Mainers will figure it out. We'll figure out how to make it work.
Well, I'm glad to hear that from you. Marcus, thanks, and thank you for coming to the show.
Sure, my pleasure.
We need to be informed citizens. Read Marcus Hutchins' column, The Coastal Economist, in the Lincoln County News. I learn from it every time I read him. Marcus, thank you.